Hello and welcome. My name is Sybil Stacpoole. I'm the Assistant Graduate Tutor here at Jesus College, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our first online alumni event for the postgraduate community. So we have three wonderful speakers to hear from today, selected from the graduate conference that was held earlier this year. So I can vouch for the fact that they all have some considerably interesting things to tell us about. Now, because this is the first time that we have tried an online event, we'd be very grateful for any feedback that you may wish to offer. So please do so to the development office. And I'm just going to have a little punt out there for all the cricketers who I'm sure are online and tell you that our very own Peter Daniel scored a first-class century in the varsity match today. So big cheer for Peter. Yes. Okay, so it falls to me to introduce our first speaker today, who is going to talk to us about the book as a socially binding object. That's Justine Provino. So we have a lecture to watch, and it's open for questions throughout, so please do send them in on the YouTube channel, and we'll hope to get some discussion going. Thank you.
Hello, I am Justine Provino. Thank you very much for virtually attending my talk on the book as a socially binding object. This presentation is a longer version of a 10-minute talk that I gave at Jesus College Graduate Conference in March. This is also a pre-recorded talk, so feel free to ask me any question using the YouTube live chat throughout this talk. Thank you very much and enjoy the talk. The book as a socially binding object. Opening my talk with this slide, I have a question for you that you can also answer in the live chat right now. Is this a book? This is an early 14th century manuscript, the Fontaine's Abbey Bestiary, illuminated and burned on parchment. By now, I guess that the vast majority of you recognized in this artifact a medieval book. Let me show you another artifact. Is this a book? It is the work of American book artist and bookbinder Ben Denzer in 2018. And, as you can see, it consists of 20 slices of American processed cheese. Even if I can't see you, I'm pretty sure that most of you had a good loaf and shook their head from left to right and said, "No, this is definitely not a book." But what if I told you that there is a copy of Denzer's artwork in the collection of artist books at the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford? Would it make it more of a book to you? When it comes to my research topic, everyone has an idea of what is a book compared to other research areas and what they look at, stem cells for instance. To go back to the two book examples that I showed you, I argue that a medieval manuscript and a cheese book are both books according to bookbinding and book conservation terminology. They are what we call codex from books. A codex from book is made of a group of leaves of sheet materials, most often parchment or paper, gathered together and secured along one edge, the spine, with some form of structure that allows either surface of each leaf to be seen when the leaves are open from the opposite edge. This slide shows a mock-up of the most ancient form of codex, the Ethiopian Eritrean binding, which I made with my former colleagues at the Bodleian Library for a bookbinding public event last summer. If we look closer, we can see that this book is made of a text block of paper, connected, laced through, therefore bound, to board cover by a red sewing thread that is sewn at the spine of the text block. And we find again this same sewing thread on the inner side of the left board cover, linking the text block to the cover. It is a similar structure that I used for my conservation treatment of the Fontaines Abbey bestiary, which I rebound with a semi-limp parchment cover and laced through with alum-taught calf songs. It is also a similar structure that Denzer used to adhere the spine of his cheese text block to a cover encasing. If 20 Slices of American Cheese is a book, why do we have such strong feelings at the idea that it is in a university library such as the Bodleian? Aren't there any other ephemeral materials in library collections? Some artifacts, which are not books, are so perishable in library and museum collections that they have a category of their own. They are called ephemera. At the Bodleian, there is a John Johnson collection of printed ephemera, which retraces British history from the 18th century to the 20th century, through advertisements, programs, menus, greeting cards, etc. In this collection, there is a desiccated Spanish chocolate bar from the 1960s. As you can see on the left side of the slide, when I did the preventive conservation treatment for this artifact, I built around the bar a sealed case with a non-acidic polyester film to prevent any risk of infestation by pests. Why was this treatment decided with the curator? Because the wrapper of the chocolate bar that could not be removed from the bar because of the way it had been attached was a beautiful instance of woodcut, and also an instance of a commercial success that can still be observed up to nowadays on chocolate bars from the same brand in Oxford. Other examples of ephemeral materials that we often don't think of are archives. For instance, political archives. At the Cambridge University Library, the UL, there is a growing collection of Brexit leaflets. Because leaflets are not publications made to last, they are often made of acidic components in the paper pulp, which means that they are prone to decaying and oxidizing over time, which can be seen by a yellowing of their aspect, a brittleness of the material at the touch. But these leaflets are collected because they are related to the history of Cambridge, and the UL acts as a physical repository for this material evidence. Other institutions, such as the British Library and the London School of Economics, even have dedicated websites to make these political materials accessible online. And then there is a category of its own among the ephemera, the self-destructive book. Agrippa, a Book of the Dead, my case study for this PhD on the access to and the preservation of the self-destructive book within the library's framework, is a paradigmatic example of this category. So far, it is the only one of its kind that I am aware of, but my research keeps me on the lookout for instances that would prove this claim wrong, and I would be delighted to be contradicted. Though many artist books have involved an element of destruction, from John Latham's Scoop Towers, burning books in the 1960s, to Stephen Emerson's latest translation of Rilke in Spores, in which a fungus grown on the book's cover feeds from the paper and ink. The materials in these books existed before they were reused in a process of creative destruction. By contrast, Agrippa was made to self-destruct and self-erase before it was turned into a burned object. But what is Agrippa exactly? And how does it self-destruct? Agrippa, a Book of the Dead, is a 1992 American artist book that is a collaboration between the publisher Kevin Begos Jr., the writer William Gibson, and the artist Dennis Ashbaugh. It is a book that is not made of cheese, but of analog paper and digital floppy disk, vintage materials maybe, but regular materials of our daily life in the written world. And still, this book self-destructs. At this point, maybe you will not be surprised to hear that the Bodleian has also a deluxe and a small edition copy of this book, along with its archive, which were donated by Agrippa's publisher, Kevin Begos Jr. in 2011. Both editions and the archive form my main resource for this PhD. The analog text block of Agrippa is supposedly made of photosensitive paper, and the printed text on this text block is the DNA of the fruit fly. The etchings of Dennis Ashbaugh represent this DNA sequence, onto which are overprinted with unfixed toner carbon ink, late 30s newspaper images advertising for vintage technologies. Here we can see a pistol, but there are also Bell telephones and so forth. Ashbaugh's prints are illustrations, in the tradition of the livre d'artiste. They are illustrations of William Gibson's autobiographical poem about finding a family Kodak photo album labeled Agrippa. It is the reason why the deluxe edition of the artist book is encased in a presentation box that takes the shape of an early century Kodak photo album labeled Agrippa. This makes it a simulacrum of the photo album Gibson found in his family home, filled with his late father's and grandfather's photographs. This vintage artifact was the germ of his poem about the dead and gave the collaborative artist book its title. Leafing through the album pages, Gibson relates family memories and his emergence as a writer. But where is Gibson's work? Gibson's work is encoded on a 1992 Mac floppy disk that was encrypted to self-erase as being read, so as to be playable only once. After a single performance of the poem, the disk would become unreadable, echoing the physical decay of the images and of the DNA of the fruit fly that always reminds us of something rotten. The floppy disk is inserted into a hollowed cavity, as you can see on the slide, which is carved into the center of the analog text block of the book. So, to sum up, Agrippa's makers intended for the printed text to fade when its photosensitive paper would be exposed to light, and for the overprints and the etchings to offset onto the next page or smudge as the pages would be burned a turn by a reader so that these images would eventually disappear. And finally, for the digital poem to be only accessible once before to self-destruct. Practically, Agrippa's makers did not fully achieve to create a self-destructive artifact. In the copies I saw of Agrippa, the text has not faded, and not all the copies have overprints, as you can see here. For instance, the National Art Library at the Victor and Albert Museum does, but the Bodleian and the Center for Book Art New York don't. The small edition copies do not have a hollowed cavity for the floppy disk, and not all the deluxe edition copies have a floppy disk, as you can see. The poem itself was secretly hijacked during the launch of the book on December 9, 1992. At its public reading on stage, it was secretly filmed and released onto internet forums. since it has been relayed from software to software, and you can see it on the YouTube video. Practically also, the makers of Agrippa induced involuntary forms of self-destruction. The presentation fiberglass box has an interior that is made of cardboard covered with an as yet unidentified paint. And these elements are very likely to off-gas acidic components onto the book, thus contributing to its acidification and oxidation and alteration both in composition and aspect of Agrippa's organic materials, which can be observed by a stiffening of its text block, the yellowing of its cloth-covered boards. And that is why, as you can see on the slide at the Bodleian, the text block, the book, is not housed with its presentation box. So, to conclude about this description of Agrippa, it is a very conceptual artwork that could be seen as mocking people. But the poem is a literary work, and the etchings are visual artworks. There is an aesthetic to this thought-provoking project that private collectors and public institutions have fetishized over since its release in 1992, and it has brought them to purchase one of the few known copies of Agrippa, up to several $1,000s for the deluxe edition. My point in drawing parallels between chocolate bars, Brexit leaflets, cheese book, and a self-destructive book is to show that we are used to having ephemeral and archival materials of all sorts in libraries and museums, and that we collect them because of the values that we attribute them. So why does it seem more shocking to us to collect a book made of cheese or a book that self-destructs than a chocolate bar in its wrapper? Because of the format used by Denzer and Agrippa's makers, the codex form book. These works trigger the visual idea we have of a book, a very familiar, traditional, and practical object of use, even when it is also considered as a refined work of art, such as an illuminated medieval bookbinding. In our collective imaginary, a book is meant to form an enduring material testimony and memory of a moment of a human creation in our written world, and that regardless whether or not it is considered as a success by any public. The very architecture of the book presents it as an ideal perennial format. More than a two-dimensional bulk of papers in an archive, we regard the three-dimensional covers of the book as a safe enclosure for our thoughts on the text block. Therefore, the codex form book, made of parchment, paper, or cheese, is not only a physically bound object, but it is also a socially binding object between us. It allows us to preserve and access information from one generation of readers to the next, and the various domains into which a book evolves emphasize this function of the book as a socially binding object, even when it is a book that self-destructs. Indeed, the book is a creation around which actors interact. Writers, book artists, and publishers, in the case of Agrippa, Begos, Gibson, and Ashbow. Readers, private collectors, curators, librarians, book conservators, book dealers, auctioneers, such as Sotheby's, scholars, and so forth. As actors in the book network, we have socio-economic ties to one another, which are buying, accessing, and preserving the object book for our own pleasure, research, enrichment of cultural heritage. Those socio-economic ties take place in multiple domains of the life of the object book, We give the book literary, economical, cultural, and historical values, and so forth, according to where we locate it, in the bookshop, at home, on the internet, and in libraries and museums, of course. Consequently, we interact and care for differently with the materiality of a book according to the domain into which it is located. For instance, when you buy a book from the bookshop, you may put it on a shelf to store it at home. But it is unlikely that you would keep your book in a climate-controlled environment to willfully preserve it. When, on the contrary, in libraries and museum spaces, preservation is intrinsically related to the area. We have secure storage areas in any historical building, and as conservator, we make sure to monitor the environment in these areas between ideally 18 to 20 degrees Celsius, more or less 50% relative humidity, and with a light exposure that is not beyond a certain amount of lux per hour, according to the material's capacity to fade that light exposure, and we have instruments to measure that. We also have integrated pest management plan, trapping insects with pheromone traps and identifying them to prevent infestation. In addition, within these institutional physical boundaries, we as users are instructed on how to interact with books. Behind exhibition cases, with books we cannot use but only see as museum objects. Some books are even considered materially so rare and fragile that conservators and curators restrict their access, even in guarded reading rooms. Because, after all, are not all the books prone to self-decaying somehow, and some more than others? Illuminations with white lead paintings are prone to corrosion, such as are the strongest metal chain or clasp on a medieval binding when exposed to air. Wood, paper, and parchment, animal skin, are organic materials which necessarily age, alter, can desiccate, or become moldy if they are not kept in the right environment. Of course, an answer to some of these physical restrictions for fragile books is digitization, or digital access of data, such as it is the case for Agrippa's poem. Even if it is not the same feel as seeing the artifacts, those are very effective preventive conservation methods of providing access to any work content without altering the physical materials. One may ask, is digital more perennial than analog then? That would be forgetting that softwares need to be updated to keep functioning, and that even if Agrippa's 1992 floppy disk had not been encoded to self-destruct, very few of us would be able to read it nowadays, as it has become an obsolete technology and we would need a Mac computer from the time to read it. My aim here has been to show that we are consumers of the written word throughout the physical and digital technological evolution of its codex form book, from the Ethiopian Eritrean model to the latest form of e-book, reproducing the feel of page turning at the reader's touch. And thus, we expect the other actors of this book social network to find ways to not deprive us from the information that is embedded in the materiality of a text. And Agrippa is mischievously doing quite the contrary. But Agrippa is also making us aware of the support book, of an analog and digital interface that we take for granted until it is broken. Torn pages, detached covers, frozen screen. The object book is bound to self-decay eventually, and to keep being passed on, it needs its network of people around it. And as for Agrippa, it is exactly how it lives nowadays, even though it practically self-destructed at least once in the Sybil reading during the launch on December 1992. Agrippa lives and is preserved through its various copies and their different conservation conditions in private and public collections. Agrippa lives and is preserved through the archive of its publisher, which documents the creation of Agrippa and the reaction to Agrippa from the public in newspapers and articles. Bigos himself gathered and preserved Ashbow's artist proofs and his experiments in the process of overprinting, together with information on the making of the fiberglass presentation box and the contract for the encryption code. These items are all in the Bodleian archive. And there is a community of people around this self-destructive book that has found ways to reshape it so as to make it as much as possible accessible to us without going against the maker's intent that their book would self-destruct. The library is now the framework that allows this network of digital and physical data to be reconnected, allowing the researcher to glimpse the unfolding process of a one-off, entirely unrepeatable performance. So yes, to access Agrippa, we accept to play a game with the makers of the project, but it also triggers our agency as readers and viewers in the social network of the self-destructive book. Agrippa shows us that by understanding the format of this book, encoded on a software, on the internet, as an artist book in the library, we are able to appropriately preserve it, display it, and use it as the book should be, through its network. To conclude, what does the self-destructive book as a socially binding object bring to us? Through technological obsolescence and modeling of the codex from book, it brings us an understanding of our role as users. In book destruction from the medieval to the contemporary, Jill Partington and Adam Smythe explain us that we see the written support as an extension of our thoughts. That is why we have such a visceral relationship to the object book and do not want it to be destroyed. However, we know that we have been destructing books for a very long time, during wars, and the Second World War is a very contemporary reminder of this for us, during any reformations of the church. A very nice medieval illuminated text can become a lining support for the spine of another book. And there is an ongoing project called the Fragmentarium that is dedicated to retrace its evidences of relocated fragmentary manuscripts. So, to conclude, looking at Agrippa, we are reminded in a very punning way that we have been playing a major part in consumption, recycling, and passing on of the codex from book. And that, regardless of the ontological ability of any material text to be an ephemera. Here is a short bibliography. If you are interested in further readings, I recommend the book of Amaranth Borsuk called The Book to know more about the object book as an interface between an author and the reader. In terms of the scholarship around Agrippa, the two most prominent scholars are Matt Kirschenbaum and Alan Liu. So I recommend both their book. The book of Kirschenbaum focuses on the transmission of Agrippa as an organic event, which similarly to other organic components of nature, atoms, matters, flourishes in an anthropic, disorganized manner. And the book of Liu's, the chapter dedicated to Agrippa, relates it to both Gibson's science fiction genre that sets his novel in a dark and decaying environment, and to the wider phenomenon of society's destruction in the 20th century, post-nuclear books. In addition, I would like to note that in 2005, Alan Liu and his team of researchers on the transcriptions project on literature and information culture at the University of California, Santa Barbara, launched the scholarly website, The Agrippa Files, an online archive of Agrippa, a Book of the Dead. Matthew Kirschenbaum also participated in this venture dedicated to recording information on the making of Agrippa and its aftermath, and he produced a video of Agrippa that is on YouTube with the agreement of Begos and the hackers. I consider this website to be a digital counterpart to the Bodleian archive, and it has constituted my second core resource on Agrippa. I also recommend in the scholarship around Agrippa Peter Schwenger's article because it is the first scholarly article written on Agrippa at the time it was released. So it gives a seminal description of Agrippa as a work of art that is apocalyptic because it is only revealed to its readers through its process of destruction. Finally, about the book as a safe container, there is the PhD dissertation of Lucy Russell that investigates the symbolical meaning given to real or imaginary containers, such as books and chests or seleni, in the realm of material culture. If you still want to know more about my own research and what it means to research a self-destructive book when books are not anymore accessible in time of COVID-19, I wrote a blog post this summer for the Center for Material Text at Cambridge, From Copying in the Scriptorium to Coding on the Computer, Understanding the Book as Support. I would like to thank both my supervisors, Dr. Jason Scott Warren, here, Cambridge, and Dr. Christopher Fletcher at the Bodleian Library, as well as my former colleagues in conservation at the Bodleian Libraries, and my funders for this collaborative doctoral award, the Cambridge Trust and the Art and Humanities Research Council. Thank you very much for your attention. I really hope you enjoyed this talk and that it pushed you to run to your library shelves and check the state of your books. If you notice any self-destructive books, please contact me. I'm always on the lookout for them. Now, your mission, should you accept it, is to ask me any questions that you should have using the YouTube live chat, and I will gladly answer you. This recording will not self-destruct in 5 seconds. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Wonderful. Well, I hope that everybody was able to interact through the chat. I could see some interesting questions coming through, and Justine has been responding to those. So if anybody else would like to send a question through, you're very welcome so to do. We had some comments about whether or not one might consider a series of photos of a book that no longer exists to be a book. And Justine has said, no, it wouldn't be a book, it would be photographs, because they're not part of the making process of the book, the analogue codex form, or indeed a digital evolution of this form. But it's an interesting one to get us thinking, isn't it? So I'd just give it another moment in case anybody else wants to send through a question on the chat before I introduce our next speaker. So I would now like to introduce Jake Moscrop, who is going to talk to us about ways to enhance pollination of the broad bean. I think I got that slightly wrong, but Jake, do come on up.
Okay, thank you, Sybil. So yes, I'm Jake, and I'm going into the third year of my PhD in the Department of Plant Science. and I'm going to be talking about my research, which is looking at enhancing pollination in broad beans. So first off, just a little introduction about me and how I got into research and ended up doing my PhD here at Cambridge. So I grew up in Cumbria on a livestock farm. So back home on the farm, it's moorland in the lakes in Cumbria, and we have a small herd of sheep and Aberdeen Angus cows. So from the beginning, being on the farm really helped me get an interest in the natural world. And this was helped by my parents, who have always farmed in a low-impact way and encouraged wild habitats like wildflower meadows. So pretty much from the get-go, had a strong interest in the natural world. So applied to university, went to Durham, where I studied biology for 4 years. And during my time at Durham, specialised more and more in plants and conservation, and ended up doing a placement year at the National Botanic Garden of Wales. So I was there as a research intern, and while I was there, I was working on a project studying the foraging habits of honeybees. So we were using a technique called DNA barcoding, which allowed us to identify the plants visited by honeybees. I was also able to go to Borneo, where I did some research looking at tropical rainforest trees and how selective logging was influencing and changing the tree species growing in an area. So at the end of my degree, I got a job working as a field trials technician at NIAB in Cambridge. So NIAB is the National Institute of Agricultural Botany. And while I was there, I was testing and characterising new crop varieties before they go into the UK market and are approved for use. So at NIAB, I specialised in broad beans. And after being at university, being at NIAB, I had quite strong interests in both farming and agriculture and conservation. So I ended up looking at PhDs, which led me on to my current PhD, which I'm doing here in Cambridge at the Department of Plant Science. And my PhD is now a good combination of both agriculture and conservation in a good department in a wonderful lab. So that brings me on to my project. So my work is looking at how to make the flowers of broad bean plants more attractive and beneficial to their main pollinator, the bumblebee. So first off, let's visit some fundamentals. Pollination and pollinators are always mentioned in the media. They're quite big buzzwords, if you will. So let's establish what exactly is meant by those terms and why pollination is so important to us and some of the challenges that pollinators face. So at the most fundamental level, pollination is the transfer of pollen, which contains plant sperm, from the male parts of a flower to the female parts. This allows fertilization to occur and then the development of seeds and fruits. Now, plants can use many different means to achieve pollination, so things like wind and water, but also animals. So animals effectively transfer pollen between flowers, and plants which use animal pollinators often have big, interesting flowers with different shapes and colours and smells and nectar. So now, after millions of years of evolution, we have a big, diverse range of interesting flowers and pollinators. So that's all fascinating in its own right, but why should we care specifically about pollinators for ourselves? Well, it's been estimated that up to 30% of our food crops absolutely depend on animal pollinators for their reproduction. So this means if you exclude animal pollinators from such crops, they can experience a 90% reduction in their yield. Obviously, this is quite a staggering number and just goes to show how important pollinators are for some plants. Overall, it's been estimated that up to 75% of our crops benefit from animal pollination in some way. So again, if you remove pollinators from those plants, they can also receive detrimental effects in terms of reproduction. Now, this includes many familiar food items, so many vegetables, fruits, nuts, and berries, which provide us with most of our vitamins and micronutrients. So it's obviously very important for human health. Now, unfortunately, it's become apparent that pollinators have been decreasing in terms of abundance and diversity since around the 1980s. Obviously, this is worrying from the perspective of preserving global biodiversity, but also for our future food security. So we think a lot of reasons for pollinator declines include exposure to agricultural industrial chemicals, also loss of habitats, and a lack of forage. So this is quite a complex problem and is going to require complex solutions to try and combat. From an agricultural perspective, there are two things that we might want to do. Firstly, to make sure our crops are being pollinated effectively, we need to see that they're as attractive as possible to insects which visit them. Secondly, to help wild pollinator populations, we need to make sure our crops are as beneficial as possible to the pollinating insects, so they provide a good food source. Now, one crop in particular which benefits from insect pollination is the broad bean. So in the Western world, broad beans are often consumed in a ground-up form in foodstuffs. They're also used heavily in animal feeds because they provide a good, cheap source of protein. In the UK, a lot of our broad bean crop is exported to Egypt in the Middle East, where they're mostly consumed in a ground-up hummus form. So the UK is actually one of the largest global producers. Broad beans are pollinated by the bumblebee, Bombus terrestris, and this is one of the largest and one of the most common bumblebee species in the UK. Now, previous research has established that if you remove bumblebees from broad bean plants, they experience significant drops in their seed set. It's also been suggested that the presence of bumblebees in broad bean crops can help to reduce the negative effects on seed set of heat stress and drought. So this is likely to get worse as we experience climate change and more extreme weather events. So if we want to advise plant breeders on how to make sure their varieties are as attractive and beneficial as possible to bumblebees, we first need to understand what it is about flowers that can attract pollinators and influence their decision to land and pollinate a flower. So let's think about flowers. So flowers have evolved to be a plant's advertising display to pollinators. They're there to be as attractive as possible to get pollinators to come in, land on them, and transfer that pollen, causing fertilization. So there are lots of different influences that can affect bees' choices. Firstly, we have factors which can be detected by a bee before it gets close to the plant. This includes the smell produced by volatile compounds. Next, as the bee gets closer to the flower, there is obviously the physical appearance of the flower. So not just the colour and the size, but also the shape and the patterning too. So broad beans have this quite distinctive pattern where they've got these big dark spots on what we call the wing petals. If the bee then decides to land on the flower, there is the texture. So texture is really important because it allows the bee to grip onto the flower and hold on. So if petals are too smooth, the bee simply slides off and can't pollinate it effectively. In broad beans, this texture is produced by these cone-shaped cells. So under a microscope, they look like traffic cones, and they give a really velvety, grippy texture, which allows the bee to hold onto the flower. Now, you can see that broad beans have a closed flower. So in order to get inside, to get nectar and pollen, a bee needs to physically open the flower and get inside. Therefore, the force needed to do this could influence which pollinators effectively pollinate beans. Lastly, inside the flower, we have the reward. So this is offered from the plant to the pollinator. Pollinators get two things from flowers. Firstly, pollen, which provides protein, and nectar, which provides sugars. So we have all of these different characteristics which could influence bee choices in different ways. So if we want to understand how to make flowers more attractive and beneficial, we first want to know how much variation do we get in these traits in our broad beans, because we can only breed better varieties if we have enough diversity in our existing populations. Secondly, we want to know how bees respond to variation in these traits. So if you give bees choices between the two extremes of, for example, spot size, how do they behave and interact? So this is precisely what my PhD is aiming to do. So my PhD has 5 main themes. Firstly, assessing this variation in pollinator significant traits to see how much variation we get. Secondly, seeing how bees respond to extremes of this variation in the lab. I'm also looking at bee behaviour in the field, because if we want this research to have real-world implications, we need to see that bees make these choices in a real agricultural landscape. I'm also exploring variation in some novel traits, so things that people haven't looked at in depth before. This includes the force needed to open the flowers. Lastly, I'm starting to look at genes involved in petal texture. So how do we produce these cone-shaped cells on the surface? And if we can understand how they develop, perhaps we can breed varieties with more of these cells, which provide more grip to bees. So I'm going to explore a few of these things in this talk and share the methodologies I've been using and some results. First off, let's look at variation in significant traits. So to do this, I've been growing hundreds of different plants in greenhouses over the winter months and taken lots of measurements to estimate variation in some key things like nectar production, pollen, flower dimensions, and flower colour. So first off, let's explore nectar. So nectar is the sugary solution produced by plants to attract pollinators. In broad beans, the nectar is produced inside the flower by nectaries hidden at the base of what we call the reproductive complex, which contains the nectar and the pollen. So in order to estimate how much nectar is produced by a flower, you need to dissect that flower. So this is precisely what I do. I dissect out the reproductive complex, isolating the nectar-producing parts. I can then place these parts inside a small tube with holes at the bottom, so it's effectively a sieve. I can then put this inside a larger tube, and when you spin this down in a centrifuge, all of the nectar flows through the tube and the solids stay in the top. You can then weigh how much nectar is in the tube to estimate how much is being produced by each flower, and using an apparatus called a refractometer can get a readout of how much sugar is in each nectar sample. So once that's been all done, you can collate results together for different flowers and get an estimate of how much is produced by different varieties. So here are some initial results. We have 11 different broad bean varieties, and we have the nectar volume in microliters. So looking at this, we can see there are some differences between our varieties. 2 I'll point out are lynx, which produced on average 4.4 microliters, and at the other side of the scale we have INRA 29H, which produced just 2.4. So we can see there are some differences and therefore the potential to breed for better varieties. However, a large nectar volume doesn't necessarily mean a variety is great for bees. We also need to think about sugar content, because if there's more sugar in the nectar, then the bee gets more energy per unit volume. So here we have the same 11 varieties, and this time nectar concentration as percentage weight by volume. So again, we have some differences. LG Cartouche and Lynx came out at the top with over 50% sugar in the nectar, and down at the bottom we had BPL10 at 25.3%. So these results are good because they show that variation does exist between broad bean varieties. Therefore, if we wanted to breed a variety with, for example, enhanced nectar content, we might select varieties like LG Cartouche and Lynx to be parents rather than something like BPL10, which has quite a low nectar content. Now, as well as nectar, bees get pollen from plants. So adult worker bees collect pollen and take it back to the colony where they feed it to baby bees. And the pollen contains protein, which is really important for bee growth and development. So this is an electron micrograph, so a zoomed in image of pollen. And basically what pollen is a hard shell. And inside that hard shell, we have cells containing cytoplasm and proteins. Now, previous work has quantified the overall pollen produced by different bean varieties and has found that there are some differences in the overall amount of pollen produced, and therefore potentially a different amount of nutrition available to bees from different varieties. Other research has also suggested that it's only live pollen which is nutritionally beneficial for bees, because dead pollen has degraded cell contents and lower nutrition and is effectively a bit of a dry husk. So I've been trying to estimate how much live pollen we have produced by different broad bean varieties. So to do this, I've been using a stain which stains pollen red if it's alive and has intact cell contents, and blue if it's non-viable and has degraded cell contents. So I can then stain samples and count in that sample how many pollen grains are red or blue. As with a lot of research, this sounds very simple to do, but in actual fact, it takes many weeks of collecting pollen and staining it, and many, many more weeks of counting pollen. So in order to get data from this, I actually had to count more than 200,000 pollen grains on a microscope by hand. So here we have some results. We have my 11 different varieties and pollen viability, so what proportion of the pollen was stained red. So actually, all of the varieties have quite high viability. They're all over 90%. The only one which stands out quite highly is Lynx, which had viability of 91.6%. So from these results, it seems like broad bean varieties I've looked at already have quite a high pollen viability and potentially quite a high protein reward for bees, which is fantastic. So perhaps from a breeding perspective, we might want to concentrate on enhancing nectar rather than specifically pollen viability. Now, once I've identified variation in selected traits in broad beans, I can test out whether variation in these traits affects bee behavior in any way. Because in order for traits to be useful in a breeding context, bees need to be able to recognize the differences between flowers. So to do this, we use bumblebees in the bee lab. So the bees basically have a large arena that they can fly around in, and we can put different objects inside the arena to see how bees learn and behave. So one thing I've been exploring with the bees is petal spot size. So this is a characteristic which varies quite considerably between bean varieties. So we have some varieties, like the one at the top, which has a relatively large spot size, and ones at the bottom which have a comparatively small spot size. So I would like to know, firstly, when bees first see these flowers, do they have any inbuilt preference for large spots or small spots? Secondly, regardless of whether they have any inbuilt preference, can they at least tell the difference between the spot sizes? So basically, can they distinguish flowers based off spot size alone? Now, the problem is broad beans differ in many different factors, not just one, like spot size. So in order to study this in the lab, we need to use an artificial system which eliminates these other variables. So to do this, I actually use plastic models. To make these models, I take impressions of rose petals to give the model a realistic petal texture. So as I said before, if it's too smooth, the bees just fall off. So we want the bees to be able to grip onto these flowers. I can then mold epoxy models which mimic the configuration of a bean flower in quite a rudimentary way, but nevertheless, still works. And I can then draw on spot sizes based off the largest and smallest spots we see in real varieties. So I then place these in the bee arena to do my experiments. The first experiment seeks to find out if bees have any preference when they first see the flowers. So to do this, I put sugar solution on all of the flowers, which is exactly the same, so the bees have a reason to visit them and forage. I then record the bees' first 10 choices. So which ones does she land, the first 10? And I can see, does she skew more towards large spots or more towards small spots? I can then do another experiment, which is a conditioning test. So this is to see if bees can associate spot size with a reward and learn to remember that one spot size means reward and the other doesn't. So to do this, one size has sugar solution and the other size has a bitter tasting quinine solution, which doesn't taste nice to the bees. I then record her first 200 visits to see if over time she learns to go to the correct choice where the reward is and avoid the bitter tasting solution based off spot size alone. So let's see some results. So this is results from the innate preference test. So here we have an average from 50 bees from 4 different colonies. So basically the charts show the proportion of bees which chose large spots or small spots. If the bar on the right is bigger, it means that more bees chose small. If the bar on the left is bigger, more bees chose large. So we can see on the very first time the bee sees the flowers, there is a pretty even split between large and small, and there isn't a significant difference between large and small preference. And overall, on average, from the first 10 choices, there is no significant difference. So basically what this means, there's no observable difference in bee preference for large or small spots. However, can they at least tell the difference between spot sizes? Or in other words, can spot size act as a useful guide to help bees learn which flowers are better? So on this chart, we have the number of visits made by the bee along the bottom, up to 200, and the proportion of visits made to the correct choice up the side. So what I'm going to show you is an average for 20 bees from 3 different colonies. If the bees can't use spots to learn, we'd expect the line to follow around 50-50 for the whole duration of the experiment, but if they can learn, we'd expect them to veer towards the correct choice over time. So here we can see the bees start off around 50-50, and they do indeed learn to go to the correct choice more and more, and after about 100 visits, it plateaus. So this indicates that overall bees can use spot size, and this is important because if, for example, we wanted to breed a broadbean variety with enhanced sugar content and nectar, we also want to link that to a visual trait, so the bees can recognize which flowers are better for them and remember to go back to them. So now that I've established this, I can also do some more interesting experiments looking at if spot size can affect foraging efficiency and how quick bees can identify flowers. Now, as well as doing work in the lab with bees, we need to see if they show any difference in behavior in the field. So do they have any preference over different varieties which look and in the nectar taste different? So this year in the summer, I did a small pilot field study, mostly to develop methodologies for next year when I plan to do a bigger study. So I did a small pilot study, and I will share the methodology for that. So basically, for this study, I grew 2 different varieties side by side. One is called Maris Bead, which has a relatively large volume of concentrated nectar, and another variety, NV129, which comparatively has quite a small volume of not very sweet nectar. So when the varieties started flowering, I went to the field and tried a few different observation methods. So basically, I sat there in the plots, recorded the number of bees I saw in each plot, but also recorded their behavior. So did a bee come into the plot, hover, and then leave without landing? Did the bee come into the plot, land on a flower, and visit it properly and pollinate it? Or did the bee come in and do what we call nectar robbing? So this is basically when they come onto the flower, chew a hole at the back where the nectaries are, just steal the nectar and not actually pollinate the flowers. So as I said, tried a few different methods for observing bees, got some preliminary observations, which are just quite interesting to look at. So I'll share them. So here we can see the number of bees on Maris Bead and NV129 on 2 separate days in the summer. So we can see that overall, there were more bees on Maris Bead than NV129. So they did prefer the one with the better nectar. It's also quite interesting to see that there was a roughly equal split of bees robbing and visiting properly. So that's quite interesting to see. Now, unfortunately, my field trials were disrupted slightly by lockdown, but I still managed to get some good tests of methodology and evaluated my trial and can do some bigger studies next year. And I can also select some maybe different varieties to compare to see how different characteristics influence bee decisions. So I've covered a snapshot of my PhD in this talk. Alongside the work I'm currently doing, I'm also planning on doing some different things. So firstly, looking at if there are any differences in broadbean varieties in terms of the volatile compounds, so the smell. Also looking at the genetic basis of texture. So how do we produce these cone-shaped cells? Because if we can understand how they develop, perhaps we can breed varieties with more of them and are easy for bees to grip onto. Lastly, looking at the force needed to open the flowers. Does this differ between varieties? This hasn't really been looked at before, so we want to establish, are there any differences? Are any varieties easier than others, and therefore easier for bees to visit? So in summary, if we can identify characteristics which allow bees to find flowers faster and interact with them quicker, then we can make better use of our crop plants. Plus, if we can make them more rewarding for insects by increasing things like pollen and nectar content, then we can help to support wild insect populations too. So this project is a collaboration between the University of Cambridge Department of Plant Science, NIAB and PGRO. So I would like to give a big thank you to all of my supervisors at each of the institutions and all of the Glover Lab and Jesus College for inviting me to do this talk. If you'd like to keep up to date with my research, you can follow me on Twitter at Jake Moscrop1 and follow the Cambridge Bee Lab Instagram account where we put the day-to-day happenings of the Bee Lab. So thank you very much, and I think we might have some questions. Okay, so we have a question from Hannah, who says, that's really interesting that nectar concentration varies so much between the highest and lowest species. Can you think why different varieties would have evolved to be different by that factor? So basically, broad bean varieties have been bred by humans for our consumption. So in theory, it might have been that varieties might have veered off. So when you're breeding for one thing, perhaps disease resistance, you might say, okay, we're just selecting for good disease resistance and we're not looking at nectar concentration at all. So that could be potentially one way in which nectar concentration could vary. Also, I mean, there's just natural variation. You know, if you necessarily haven't been breeding for something, you've just selected some plants which, yeah, good for one thing, but it's not good in terms of the nectar. Okay, we have another question, again from Hannah. So she's basically saying, for bee experiments, do we have more intelligent and less intelligent bees? So that's quite interesting. When you're doing bee experiments, yeah, bees do have personalities. So the data I showed you was the average for a lot of bees. So for example, the one where there was the reward and the bitter solution, that was 20 bees. And 200 visits per bee. So that was 4,000 visits for the bees. But if you see the individual lines before they've been averaged and merged, there is actually variation. Some bees might learn really quickly, maybe like before 50 visits, they're just like, yep, I've got this really quick. Other bees, you can just, well, sometimes it's a pain. For example, I had one bee, she came out, she visited the flowers, then she went and just looked at the corner. And just like, I'm like, come on, you need to do another 100 visits. So yeah, you do get variation. Just like with all animals, if you're working with animals, they have their own personalities. Cool. So I think it's time for the next speaker. So thank you very much for having me for the talk, and I hope it's been interesting to you. So yeah, thank you very much to Jesus College as well.
Black X to stand on. Brilliant. Thank you, Jake. Brilliant. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. These talks all come from the postgraduate conference which we had earlier in the year. In fact, we were lucky enough to have it before lockdown occurred. And you can see the amazing variety of the different talks. By the way, I'm Tim Wilkinson. I'm one of the other graduate tutors in the college. And you can see there's this breadth and depth of subjects. It's one of the reasons I really like the postgraduate conference, because it's just a great day to learn and see what the fantastic talent of the Jesus College graduate community is like. And a good example of that is our next speaker, who is very privileged because she's an MPhil student. And actually, one of the things about the graduate conference is that the PhDs have a slight advantage. They have a little bit more time. They've often developed things better, whereas the MPhils are often very fresh out the blocks and don't really get much time to develop their presentations. But an example of a fantastic presentation during our conference from Ella Monkcom, sorry, I missed the name right. And her topic, which is a very long title and I can't read it from this angle, is to do with the joys of breastfeeding. So I will hand over to Ella.
Hello. So, as I was just introduced, my name is Ella Monkcom, and I was a master's student in health, medicine, and society. So it's a kind of interdisciplinary master's, but I was specifically looking at the sociology of health and illness. So before I did that, I did an undergraduate degree in health and human, social, and political sciences, and I was looking at sociology and also biological anthropology. So today I'm going to be talking about breastfeeding, as you can tell from my title. So my full title is, It Was a Mental Struggle of I Want to Do This, but I Don't Want to Do This. British Women's Experiences of Pain During Breastfeeding. So, to begin, when I say the word breastfeeding to you, you probably have images something like this. So we kind of have attractive young women in the West, often white, kind of looking down at their baby, very serene, a very kind of peaceful experience. You may also have mental images of women from other parts of the world where breastfeeding is more common. It's a kind of nurturing, kind of beautiful event, basically. Alternatively, when I say the word childbirth to you, you probably have images more like this. So women in intense pain, maybe lots of screaming. In TV shows and film, it's always very, very scream-heavy and stressful and lots of swearing. And maybe babies kind of covered in gunk, babies also screaming. Overall, just a very stressful event. You may also have images of kind of C-section rooms and lots of medical staff. So as we have these images, it may surprise you to hear this quote from one of my interviewees. I'd go through childbirth again tomorrow, but I never want to learn to breastfeed again. So this is actually something that I heard quite a lot when I interviewed women that had breastfed, that actually childbirth, I mean, one woman even described it as a walk in the park compared to breastfeeding. So this is by no means the experience of every breastfeeding woman, but I think it's really interesting to think about why we have these very set ideas about what breastfeeding and childbirth are, yet this is actually the experience that a lot of women are having. So my kind of goals for today are to kind of think about breastfeeding in a more complex and nuanced way. So there's very set ideas that most people tend to have, and probably a lot of the people watching have never given it any thought, which is also fine. And I guess I want to introduce a new narrative and show how things might be a little bit more complicated. I also want to look specifically at the results of my master's dissertation. So as I was introduced, as Tim said, I've only obviously done a 9-month master's, which was heavily interrupted this year. So this is just, the results from this year. And I did initially want to talk through my conclusions because I had 5 major results and 3 conclusions, but I felt that it might be easier for a broad audience like this just to talk about the results. But I'm happy to answer questions about that later. So I'm going to be looking at why infant feeding choices matter. Why should we care whether people are breastfeeding or bottle feeding or anything? What the situation is with breastfeeding in the UK. A little bit about existing research. I'm definitely not going to do that justice by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm going to touch on that. My research and my results. And I'm going to very briefly mention my conclusions. And as I said, I can always expand on that. So, why should we care about infant feeding choices? The first thing to say is, what is an infant feeding choice? So people can feed their babies in lots of different ways. As a generalization, when people have a baby, they have to make a choice, and I stress that that's in inverted commas, about how they want to feed an infant. So generally, you can produce milk through your breasts and give that to the baby, which would be breastfeeding. You can also express milk, so use a pump to remove milk, which you can give to the baby through a bottle. Some women I spoke to also donated milk, so there's actually milk banks where you can give your expressed breast milk. You can also use formula milk, which is generally given through a bottle. And there's also other kind of forms. You can syringe feed, which is where you literally syringe milk into a baby's mouth when they're very young, and you can even cup feed as well when they're very young. So it's a kind of complicated arena. Generally, we think about it as a choice between bottle feeding with formula milk and breastfeeding. The reality is that actually the vast, vast, vast majority of parents do both. So it's kind of presented as this dichotomy, but it's actually something that most people do. So why should we care about infant feeding choices that individual families or individual mothers or parents are making? So the first thing that probably comes to mind for anyone who's ever thought about breastfeeding at all or bottle feeding are the health benefits. So there have been studies for the last 40 or 50 years, many studies, that suggest there are health benefits for mother and baby to breastfeeding. So this is a kind of very classic poster. So it says, benefits associated with mums who breastfeed, reduced risk of breast cancer, reduced risk of ovarian cancer, reduced risk of high blood pressure, reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. So obviously these are just for mums. There's also a lot of corresponding potential benefits for infants. So reduced risk of asthma, reduced risk of rare childhood cancers, and also diabetes and many other things. I'm not going to go into this today for reasons that are hopefully kind of clear in terms of time, but a lot of these studies are kind of a bit complicated and there has been a lot of criticism of the science. So, for example, a lot of parents we know who do choose to breastfeed tend to be well educated, they tend to be middle class. And so there's a lot of kind of confounding factors that may also be affecting some of these health outcomes. The important thing to remember for the purposes of this is that it's well accepted generally by scientists and also by policymakers, importantly, that there are health benefits to breastfeeding. Now, because of these potential health benefits and as a result, potential economic savings, so the NHS does prioritise breastfeeding as it says it's not only good for mothers and babies, but it will also save millions and millions of pounds in theory. Because of these health benefits, generally, breastfeeding is held up as the right decision. So it's very much explicitly seen as the best way to feed a baby. So this is all very kind of class-based and it's kind of complicated. I can't go into a lot of the nuances today, but in a lot of circles, especially kind of white, educated, middle-class circles, as probably a lot of the viewers will be, breastfeeding is seen as the right thing to do. It's seen as the way that you're going to help your baby and you're going to help yourself. As a result, it's taken on this meaning bigger than itself. So there's a lot of literature that suggests that some women see breastfeeding as an almost religious experience. It's vital. It's the only way you can be a good mother, the only way you can do right by your baby. So the sociologist Charlotte Faircloth says, among all the elements of mothering, infant feeding is the one that is most conspicuously moralized. So the point here is that you don't have to agree with this, but you just have to recognize that breastfeeding is a really, really big deal. And I think anyone who isn't a parent, which includes me, maybe struggles to understand this, but it's really important to try and get in that headspace when you're looking at the issue of pain. So, breastfeeding in the UK. So, the UK follows WHO guidelines on breastfeeding, which basically say that we should be exclusively breastfeeding our babies for 6 months, then introduce soft foods, and then we should be breastfeeding for up to 2 years or beyond. So there are cases of women who like to full-term breastfeed, that's the phrase, and that can be up to age 6, 7, 8. So this can be something that women invest a huge amount of time and energy into. However, that's often not the case in the UK. So if we compare the UK to maybe similar countries like Sweden, about 80% of women are breastfeeding at month 6. In the UK, about a third of women are breastfeeding at month 6, but actually less than 1% are doing so exclusively. So less than 1% of women in the UK are following those WHO guidelines. One of the interesting things here is that 90% of women in the UK say they're giving up breastfeeding before they want to. So we kind of need to think about why that's the case. You know, if women are saying they're happy giving it up early, that would be something different, but actually 90% are not. So in terms of the reasons why they're giving up breastfeeding, the most recent survey was done in 2010. Several different things came up, including exhaustion, the amount of time it takes to breastfeed. So one of the women I spoke to this year was breastfeeding for about 15 hours a day in her first few weeks. So that's a huge time and energetic investment. And around 10 to 20% say they give up directly as a result of pain. So that maybe makes it seem like around a fifth of women are giving up because of pain. in reality, we know that about 62% of women are experiencing pain when they breastfeed, at least at some point. So even if only a small number give up because of that, it's playing a much bigger role than we usually recognise. One thing I think is really interesting is that so many women are experiencing pain but still not giving up. So I think that kind of, that say 40% of women who are having that experience but deciding not to give up is also a really, really interesting finding. So, previous research. Most research about breastfeeding has been conducted by, well, actually a range of different subjects. So the medical sciences is perhaps an obvious one. Lots and lots and lots of studies looking at the health benefits of breastfeeding, which I kind of mentioned earlier, and also of bottle feeding. There have also been a lot of studies in health economics, looking at the potential economic impact on our healthcare systems and on individual families. There have been a lot of studies within policy and politics, looking at how we can increase breastfeeding rates, because we have this very set idea that it's the best way that infant feeding should be done. Almost all of the research has been devoted to why aren't women breastfeeding, predominantly looking at things like the amount of support they're getting, the amount of training that midwives or other support services get, and whether women get things like harassment in public when they breastfeed, that kind of thing. So this here is a very classic example of a breastfeeding study. So this has been commissioned by UNICEF for the British government, and it's looking at preventing disease and saving resources, the potential contribution of increasing breastfeeding rates in the UK. So almost all this research is all about breastfeeding is good, how can we increase the rate? In addition, there is also some kind of feminist and social science research about breastfeeding, a lot of it in fact, and feminist and social science research tends to be quite interrelated, so I'm kind of using those together. They tend to be a little bit more complicated in terms of their kind of opinion, if you like, about breastfeeding. So some feminists kind of see breastfeeding as problematic because it's using a lot of women's energetic resources, it potentially forces them to stay at home, a lot of criticism about how the public treats breastfeeding women. But in general, most feminist research has been very, very pro-breastfeeding. And because of the problems that many breastfeeding women face in terms of harassment in public, they've really, really focused on how great breastfeeding is. So all the narratives have said, breastfeeding's wonderful, every woman can breastfeed, breastfeeding is available to any woman, and breastfeeding is a natural behaviour. So it's all been very kind of positive language, how can we increase breastfeeding rates? Now, I have absolutely no issue with these narratives at all, and it's not my intention to kind of challenge these and say they're wrong at all. My intention is instead just to kind of say, this is one part of the conversation, and actually there's some other narratives that we haven't really been exploring. So one problem with some of this research, or not a problem with the research, but an absence of research, is about how women actually experience breastfeeding. We've been kind of so busy looking at how we can increase it that we haven't really asked women what breastfeeding is like. So what we do know is that, as I mentioned earlier, almost 2/3 of British women experience pain when they breastfeed, which is quite a lot of people. A small number of studies have looked at these experiences, so there have been some like qualitative and mixed method studies which have looked at how breastfeeding is experienced. Only a few of these have been based in the UK, so this is a small number of kind of global studies across the last 20, 30 years. And very few have focused on pain specifically. So most of what I've been reading has said problems in the early postnatal period, and then it kind of mentions, oh, yeah, 70% of the women we spoke to had pain, and then it kind of moves on. There's very little kind of focus, which is very much what I wanted to do today. So my research, again, this is a master's project, so I have completed it now, but it was a kind of short-term piece of work written in lockdown. I did semi-structured interviews with 22 women. Women were recruited online and through snowball sampling, so it was purposeful. So I deliberately sought out women that had experienced pain. This was actually before lockdown, the interviews, so some were in person, some were online video calling, averaged about 45 minutes. It was between kind of half an hour and an hour and a half. All of the women I spoke to continued to breastfeed through pain, which I think is a kind of quite important thing in itself that none of the women I spoke to, at least with one of their children, had given up. Although not all the women I was speaking to were following those WHO guidelines, several were. So this is not necessarily a representative sample by any stretch. Demographically as well, not something I'm going to talk about too much, but demographically, half of the women I spoke to had postgraduate degrees. So this is not a representative sample. Only 2 didn't have an undergraduate degree. But this is a kind of classic breastfeeding demographic. That's how we might see it. And I also did data analysis using Noel et al. And several other references for conducting a trustworthy thematic analysis. I'm not going to talk about this too much because I don't know if it's that interesting for the general audience, but I can always answer a question on it later. So I just want to really briefly mention why the women were in pain, because I kind of realized when I was practicing this that unless you have been studying breastfeeding for 9 months, it's not immediately obvious why breastfeeding is painful necessarily. So the first thing is sore or cracked nipples and bleeding nipples as well. Some of the women I spoke to kind of said to me, well, I suppose any part of the body that is not exposed very much, that doesn't get that much use, and suddenly you're using to an intense degree, probably would be painful, which might be true. So that's kind of self-explanatory. Engorgement, so that's when the breasts feel particularly full, they can be really, really sore, and they're kind of inflamed. Yeast infections, so thrush. So I actually didn't know this was a thing until this year. I'm learning a lot of biology and a lot of things about the body. So you can actually get yeast infections like in the baby's mouth and in the woman's nipple. The problem with this is that it can be really difficult to treat because you just pass the infection back and forth. So you have to treat the baby and the mother separately. It can be weeks of treatment. Blocked ducts, so blocked milk ducts, which can lead to breast inflammation called mastitis and abscesses. So mastitis is actually really, really common. It's kind of intense stabbing pains in the breast and also flu-like symptoms. Most of the women I spoke to had mastitis at some point. And also abscesses. So only one of the women I spoke to had abscesses, which actually burst, and she had to go to hospital. So some of these situations are very extreme. And tongue tie. So this is a kind of tricky one to explain. But basically, when a baby gets milk from the breast, it uses its tongue to kind of flick the nipple at the roof of its mouth. So what that depends on is that the tongue is kind of connected in the right way to the floor of the mouth. So in some babies, the tongue isn't kind of connected properly, and it makes it very difficult to get milk out. And this can also cause quite a lot of pain for women. You can have this cut. So most of the women I spoke to had the baby's tongue tie cut, which I think is quite stressful for mothers, probably more than babies actually, or parents at least. In some women, this made a huge difference, and their pain kind of went. In some women, it didn't really make much of a difference at all. The other thing to mention at this point is actually that 6 of the women I spoke to out of 22 did not know why they were in pain. So 6 of the women were never given any answer as to why breastfeeding had been painful for them. The other thing to mention is that several of these are kind of related to, at least tangentially or maybe directly, to latching problems. So a kind of overarching theme is how the baby is attached to the breast, which will be important in a minute. So I'm just going to talk you through my 5 results now. This is going to be a lot of listening to me talk rather than things on the screen, so I can only apologise for that. I'm going to be reading out some of the quotes that the women gave me during our interviews. I decided not to put them on the board, so I've got them all written down here. The quotes can be a bit extreme and graphic, just in terms of the injuries the women sustained. I thought it was better to keep them in, though, and not sanitize the language or sanitize what I was saying, because these women's experiences haven't been heard. So that's kind of the point. Anyway, so the first theme was experiencing pain. So as I mentioned earlier, very few, if any that I can think of, studies give a really detailed account of the kind of language women are using to describe this sort of pain. So that's what I wanted to do. I really wanted to fill that gap. So some women had a pretty okay time with the pain. It was only a few days. It went by itself. It was kind of some soreness, and it wasn't a major issue. So, for example, Jennifer said, it was 2 out of 10, not much at all. However, much more common was a much more extreme account of pain that lasts weeks, months, up to a year for one of the women I spoke to, and was interfering in women's lives to a much bigger extent. Charlotte said, "I felt like I wanted to vomit at times. It was so excruciating. I just remember grabbing fistfuls of my hair and just pulling it, and just wanting another part of my body to suffer more than my nipples did." So one of the interesting things that I found was that women were actually using the same language. So these are not all women from Cambridge, it's from kind of different parts of the UK, and they were using very, very, very similar language. I actually found almost all of them used similes, so saying something is like something else, and these similes tended to be divided into three. It was a very, very interesting, very clear separation. So again, this is quite graphic. Some women use similes relating to fire and burning. So Catherine said, "It feels like someone's lit my nipple on fire." Some women use similes expressing their pain as a kind of clamping or extreme pressure. Orla said, "I would say it's a bit like having a clothes peg on your nipple, just opening and closing all the time. Yeah, it's just, like a clamp, just nipple clamps, I guess." And the third group described breastfeeding as like the nipples being cut, sliced, and shredded. So Neve said, "I did find it very painful. It's literally like, I always describe it as like your nipples being cheese grated with a grater." Yeah, so obviously quite extreme descriptions, and I'm imagining people at home kind of grabbing themselves, but I think this is why this is kind of important. So the second theme, potentially a bit less graphic, is what women expected. So probably, as is the case for most of the audience when they hear quotes like this, you probably didn't expect that it was going to be that bad. And I think most of the women I spoke to were really, really shocked by how bad their pain had been. They just did not expect it, or at least didn't expect it to be that bad. A lot of them said, "It's natural. Why would it hurt? It's natural." So Orla kind of expressed this really well. "It's an instinctive thing. Why would it, Naturally, why would it hurt that much? It doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make evolutionary sense for it to be a super painful thing. I had just thought that it would be, he'd instinctively know how to go on and it wouldn't hurt." One of the women I spoke to actually made a really interesting point, which is that we don't expect childbirth to be painless just because that's natural. We don't expect menstruation to be painless just because that's natural. So why is it that we all think breastfeeding's natural, therefore it's painless? So I think that was an interesting thing. Most women kind of spoke to me about the fact that they hadn't been told. They felt really betrayed that all of them had been to antenatal classes and very few had actually been told at these classes that it could even be painful. So Georgina said, "I went on a breastfeeding course and nowhere in that did they ever say to get you ready for how painful it was going to be. Like, they told you like ways to latch, but they didn't. I wish they told you how painful it was going to be." Alternatively, some women did know. They had sisters or friends, or they had been at classes where pain had been mentioned, but that didn't necessarily prepare them adequately for what did happen. So Florence said, "You think, yeah, I know it's going to be hard. Then when you're actually in it, it's like a different level of hardness." So the third theme I identified was a new type of pain. So this kind of relates to what I began with at the beginning, that breastfeeding is kind of maybe more unlike other forms of pain like childbirth than we might immediately have assumed. So this is quite a long quote, but I think it's quite interesting, from Rebecca. "But it's a pain I've never experienced anything like it. I mean, not in terms of intensity of the pain, but in the type of pain. Because when you're labouring, if you have periods all your life, they're more or less painful and things. So you kind of know the kind of contracting of what it feels like in your womb and stuff. But breastfeeding, nothing compares because you've never experienced anything like that. So it's a first, One thing that women tended to say that most found childbirth to be the most painful thing that had ever happened to them, but they said that breastfeeding was actually more difficult, and that's because childbirth pain, we kind of all know it's coming. Everyone knows that childbirth is a painful event. Even if you have things like C-sections and you don't go into labour, there's a lot of soreness afterwards. It's a time-limited event, so most people know it'll last a few hours or a few days. Most people have at least or in the UK, have the option of having pain relief. And women are able to kind of mentally prepare for it. You know, you kind of know what's coming. You're able to do the breathing exercises and the stuff we see on TV and things like that. Alternatively, for breastfeeding, a lot of women don't know it could even be painful, so there's no preparation. It's quite difficult to access pain medication because it actually affects your breast milk. Some women they'd solve one problem and then a few weeks later they get a new infection that lasts for months, and so it was like an ongoing problem and they never knew when it was going to end. Also, because you're having to breastfeed all the time, especially if you're doing it exclusively, it's very difficult for any injuries to actually mend or, to heal. So Maria says, unless you completely stop, which I wasn't prepared to do, then all you're doing, even if she's latching correctly, the pain doesn't go because you've already built the soreness up. So there's a sort of trauma to the breast that takes quite a while to subside. The fourth theme I found was doing it wrong. So this is a kind of complicated one to explain, but essentially women tended to get two different messages from other people about whether what they were experiencing was normal or not normal. So the first half of women got told, oh yeah, that's normal, pain is normal, which might seem like a good message because it's kind of reassuring people that their experiences are legitimate, their experiences are normal. The reality is that it could actually be quite dismissive. So, if your leg's hanging off and you say, I've got a leg ache, oh, that's normal, we went for a walk yesterday. It's not necessarily always a helpful thing to say. It depends on the situation. So for some women, the pain was kind of normal, that it resolved very quickly and they didn't need additional help. For some women, they weren't sure because it was normal whether to go to the doctor, whether to seek treatment. And so some women were in pain for kind of much longer than they needed to be. So Hayley says, and basically the message I got was, well, that's breastfeeding. Not in a horrible way, but yes, it does really hurt. And you've got to carry on and push through this bit. Alternatively, other people got told that pain is not normal unless you're doing breastfeeding wrong. So what doing it wrong usually means is that you've attached the baby wrong. So you haven't got a good latch, you haven't positioned the baby right. So Gloria said, the whole expectation was there shouldn't be pain, and if there is, it can be easily dealt with by improving the latch. So this created this image that everything will be fine as long as I work on the latch, I'll go and see someone and they'll help me. The problem was that was not the experience of most of the women I spoke to. So while some of them definitely did have issues with their latch, as I said, 6 women had no idea why they were in pain. They'd seen several professionals and all had said that their latch was wonderful. Several women also had infections and things that are much less directly related to latch, and it was very unclear. So this creates a real sense of confusion, which Maria kind of explained really well. And you get all this advice saying, well, if you're doing it right, then it shouldn't hurt. But then they say your latch is fine. And you're like, but it hurts. So as I say, for some women, latch really was the issue. But for most of my interviewees, it was actually much more complicated than that, which they were not prepared for. What this meant was that a lot of women tended to see it as their own fault. They kind of thought, well, I've been given all this advice. I'm told I'm positioning him right. So clearly it's an issue with me as a mother. So Sam said, part of it was feeling a bit like a failure as well. It feels like a natural thing you should be able to do. And the final theme I identified was called making a choice. So because of all these problems that women had encountered, they obviously had to decide, am I going to keep going or am I going to leave breastfeeding here and start bottle feeding or exclusively bottle feeding? So as I said before, all of the women I spoke to decided to continue breastfeeding, okay? So everyone gave a variety of reasons. They all kind of said the pros of breastfeeding outweigh the cons. So things like the health benefits that we mentioned earlier. Also, breastfeeding is a kind of convenient thing. You don't need all the tech. You can just kind of do it. And like the low cost. So everyone kind of made this intellectual decision. And I think an emotional one as well, because a lot of women really enjoyed breastfeeding, even though it was really painful, that was the right thing to do for them. The problem was that even though you can make this decision in a kind of sensible headway, it doesn't always mean that the decision is easy. So most of the women I spoke to said they developed a kind of physical aversion to latching the baby on, because latching the baby on meant bringing in pain and accepting pain. So Neve said, There would be times when the baby would want a feed and you'd literally be dreading it and not want your husband to pass the baby. Just keep that baby away from me. I just do not like, I quiver at the thought of the pain. So women were kind of stuck in this cycle of decision making. Every time the baby's brought to them or every time they pick the baby up to feed, they have to kind of make a decision. Do I want to go through with this in this exact moment? Not just, do I think breastfeeding is a good thing, but right now, do I want to breastfeed? So this cycle of decision making, for some women, was a really good thing. They were able to kind of assert their autonomy and they were able to kind of battle through and make a choice that they wanted to make. So Rosie said, but I'm proud of the fact that I've been able to continue. And if I'd not been able to do that, I think it would have really badly affected me. Alternatively, for a lot of other women, it was a kind of ongoing battle and they just didn't really know whether they'd made the right choice. So this is a quote from Carmen, and you may recognize that this was my title. It's really difficult to stay sane when you're experiencing that pain but are refusing to give up what is causing the pain. So I think that was just, it was a mental struggle of, I want to do this, but I don't want to do this. So they were all my kind of key findings. I'm very, very quickly just going to mention my conclusions, but I won't go into any depth about that. So I was kind of looking in my dissertation this year about the notion of infant feeding choice and what that phrase means and how it's generally kind of understood in research and literature. So I kind of argued that actually we've been seeing it in a very specific way, which we weren't acknowledging, and there was a lot more complexity. So making an informed decision, one thing I was looking at was breastfeeding women are almost always portrayed as really well informed. There's this idea that someone who knows about the benefits of breastfeeding would choose to do it. Someone who doesn't know probably wouldn't choose to do it. So it's all about, breastfeeding women being well informed. My argument was that that may be the case, but actually most of the women I spoke to were not well informed about pain. They were not well informed about problems. They were not well informed about exhaustion, and they were not well informed about what breastfeeding actually meant for them. So when we're talking about being informed, we're actually saying something very specific. Attributing blame, so I was looking at kind of how women see, whose fault it was that breastfeeding was painful, and as I mentioned earlier, the kind of language that they were being told by other people, whether that made it seem like it was their problem rather than more of a group problem. On occasion, that also included how their partner treated the pain. And choice as a process. So I was kind of looking at the idea that it's not just a single thing, you're a bottle feeder or you're a breastfeeder. This is something that has to go on for a really, really long time, at least for the women I was speaking to. Every time there's pain, they have to confront this issue of why do I want to keep going? Is it worth it? So in summary, I have kind of mentioned why we should care about breastfeeding. Why is it an issue that I would spend several months of my life reading about? Breastfeeding in the UK, so the UK having one of the lowest breastfeeding rates in the world, which not many people know. Existing research, again, haven't done that justice by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a huge amount of it, and it's potentially got some gaps. My research, trying to fill those gaps. So my results, looking at the experience of pain, what women expected, a new type of pain, doing it wrong, and making a choice. And kind of very briefly touched on my conclusions, which are a lot more complicated and have a lot more backstory, but I haven't gone into those. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Yes, I have a question. Okay, so I don't know if shall I read it out? Yeah. Amy says, do you think that times have changed in that it used to be poorer women would breastfeed and richer women would get nurses, whereas now breastfeeding has become a sort of middle-class activity? I think that's true to some extent. It's so complicated, the trends, and it also depends on where you're talking about. So in lots of parts of the world, breastfeeding is the complete norm. As I mentioned, within Europe, if you look at Northern Europe, there's still incredibly high breastfeeding rates. It's like near 100%. So it kind of depends on where you're talking about. But there's definitely an element of that I think, for example, are you able to take long maternity leave? So that's quite a class issue, but it's not necessarily directly mapped onto class. So if you're able to take a long maternity leave or a long parental leave, then being able to breastfeed might be much more of a reality for you. Whereas if you take somewhere like the States, where you have much shorter maternity leaves, it's potentially considerably more difficult, especially if you're on shift work and you can't pump and all these things. So that's definitely true to some degree. Or another one. Oh, a couple, okay. Hannah says, if you could create a government information campaign to allow women to make an informed choice before giving birth about infant feeding choice, what would you feature and how would you approach it? Oh my God, that's tricky. That's quite a big question. Okay, the only thing I can really say, because I haven't studied that, so I would need to give that a bit of thought, but I think one thing that's really interesting is that it's not necessarily the case now, but definitely a few years ago, if you opened a baby book and you turned to the infant feeding page, it would almost always say, bottle feeding, pros and cons, breastfeeding, why you should do it. So there's very rarely the same kind of conversation that admits that actually breastfeeding could be really difficult, and there may be reasons why people very legitimately might not want to do it. It's really difficult because I also completely understand why these campaigns want to encourage women to breastfeed. I suppose my argument would be that actually not telling women that it's going to be painful, and then you start the journey expecting a painless, beautiful, nurturing, connecting activity, and then find you're bleeding and in horrific pain by day 3 is not very helpful. So I think we should just have a lot more conversation about it and be a lot more open about the fact that it can be difficult, and then give the women the support they need in order to ensure that they can continue if they want to. I was wondering what the ethnic background was of the 22 women responding to your questionnaire. Yeah, so that's also kind of a slightly complicated one. Is in some sources, you see that breastfeeding women tend to be white, and I think that's potentially in terms of a relationship between class and race, so it tends to be, at least in this country, quite a middle-class occupation, a middle-class activity. But the other thing is that you also do find that women who have migrated to the UK are actually also a lot more likely than British-born women to breastfeed. So it's a kind of complicated thing. So the women I interviewed, of the 22, I'm pretty sure 17 were white and 5 were non-white and non-British born. They were from lots of different parts of the world, actually. So one was American, one was South African, so they were both still white, and then there were women of ethnic minority background as well. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so this person, I don't think they have their first name, but they've just asked what my background is. So I'm a sociologist, so yeah, I'm not a doctor, which you can probably tell by my hatchet job of explaining some of the reasons women were in pain. Yeah, I'm a sociology student, but I study health and medicine. I also am really, really interested in the interaction between biology and social life. So I studied human evolution and biological anthropology in my undergrad. So, yeah. Do you think the women who persisted despite the pain were doing so more from pressure from midwives, doctors, or pressure from their husband, partner, or pressure from themselves? I'd 100% say pressure from themselves, 100%. The women I spoke to were very varied. So a couple of mums said to me they really did feel pushed into it, and they felt pressure from the NHS, and they felt that it had really negatively impacted their mental health, and they kind of questioned, is really pushing breastfeeding the right thing to do? However, the more current narrative was very much women felt that breastfeeding was the right thing to do. They wanted to do it. Many of them kind of were at pains to stress to me that they thought women should have a choice. So they very much were saying, it's a completely free choice, but I have to breastfeed. So that was very much the message that I was getting. One of the women I spoke to had fallen out with a friend over the fact that they were giving a bottle of formula a day, because I had a friend who was also breastfeeding at the same time. So these women felt very, very passionately about it, and I definitely feel it was coming. I mean, some of them were breastfeeding against the wishes of their husbands, so that was causing a battle at home. So definitely from them. And I think that's all the questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Ella, and also Jake, and also Sybil, for excellent contributions. I hope that gives you a feeling for the talent that Jesus College has in its postgraduate community, and that is three students out of 270 at least that are currently studying this college. So you can see that what a tiny percentage it is, but what a huge and diverse group of people and subjects they're studying. And it's a really interesting and fascinating, and it's great being graduate tutor to meet and experience all these different people and subjects. This alumni event has been a relatively new thing in the college's calendar, and we had a luncheon last year which went very well, and we had once again speakers from the graduate conference that year who did similar talks in a similar style. Hence we decided this year, despite the joys of pandemic, we would continue the event and do it as virtually as we could and as safely as we could. Hence we're looking at a room with 4 socially distanced people in it from my perspective, but I think still you get a flavour and a feeling for the fantastic variety without the calories, or the travel for that matter either. So you didn't have to go all that way to come to Cambridge to see us again. So hopefully, maybe we've reached a wider audience this year. I don't know. We'll find out at some point. I should also thank the development team for the fantastic work they've been doing behind the scenes, organising this, and the chap that's up there somewhere in the box who's been doing all the IT tweaking and videoing. So I think it's come together very well, and it's an interesting perspective and a new way of doing these sorts of things. I'm learning every day about how the virtual world can be used in education in a completely different way to how I thought it was, and it's really opened my eyes to the way we can do things. So hopefully next year we'll be back to some different scenario. I wouldn't use the word normal, but something different where maybe we can do something like this again, or we can do the more formal dine and talk event. I don't know. We'll see what happens, but there'll definitely be something happening next year for the postgraduate alumni. And this resource is available on the YouTube channel, so you can go back and remind yourself of the bees. Number 32 definitely looked a bit suspicious in my opinion. So there are lots of interesting things you can go back at and look at on the Jesus College YouTube channel, and I'm sure the speakers will probably have a quick look at their channel to see if there's any further questions have lurked up since they gave their talks, in case they want to answer any further questions going on. So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we'll see you all next year.